Today we're going to talk about dating, creation, and the flood, and we're going to compare the Masoretic Text versus the Septuagint, and we'll get into what all that means. But to start with, when did creation happen according to the Bible?
6,000 years ago.
Okay. That's what we usually hear, right? We've got a timeline out there, the biblical chronology that's definitely the most well-known or used among Americans, or really the English-speaking world, is one that Bishop Ussher came up with in the 17th century, and that puts creation at about 4004 BC, right? So it's about 6,000 years old.
Now, my question is the creation. Okay, now at that time, wasn't there a different timetable and, like having 12 months? I mean, it'd be like a year or a half or something.
It's always taken us the same amount of time to make a trip around the sun.
Oh, okay.
So there is a subtle difference, which we're not going to really get into, that the Earth, because of the flood, spins slightly faster than it did. I think that when God created the Earth in the beginning and he said it was good, he said that stars were for signs and for seasons. And there's a lot of evidence that originally a year was 360 days.
Back then too?
No, not today. Today it's 365 and a quarter days, right? So that it was a perfect 360 days when it was created, but the clock or the calendar got damaged a little bit as a result of the flood because of the distribution of mass. If something pulls, I said we weren't going to get into it, but here we are. If a figure skater pulls her arms in, she spins faster, right? Same thing with the Earth. If the Earth's mass is a little more concentrated towards the center than it used to be, that means as it's making a trip around the sun, it's going to spin a few more times. And that's why, we have a 360-degree circle that we use, and our clocks are divided into nice, 60 minutes and all that. We have a lot of this sort of basic stuff, and that is probably based on the original 360 days it took us to get around the sun, where every night in the sky, the stars would tick 1 degree from where they had appeared the night before.
So what I was trying to lead to is that if you go back to the day when Christ, built the heavens and the earth, okay, there was no such thing as time.
There was time.
There was?
Right?
Oh, okay.
I mean, in the beginning, he created the heavens and the earth over 6 days. The evening and the morning were the first day. So he was doing those things in sequence, and he created day and night, ways to measure time. But time is just a byproduct of existence. But as far as the measurement of time, so I think what you're getting at is some people will say, well, those days weren't like our days. They were these long periods of time. But the sun was created on day 4 and plants were created on day 3. So how could plants survive for a long period of time without a sun, right? There's every indication that those were normal days. And when the text says, and the evening and the morning were the third day, those are indications that those are normal days, not ages. Because the word day, even in English, we can use that word to mean a period of time. But when you're using it with a number or evening or morning, that's letting the reader know these are the normal kind of day, right? So even though the sun was created on the 4th day, he created light in the beginning, and he divided the day from the night, which kind of tells you, it sounds like there was light coming from a certain direction, where kind of getting to the idea that the earth is round, that when the sun's on one side of the world, it's day on one side, it's night on the other. So 6,000, that was sort of what I was looking for, is like when I was a young man, not a Christian yet, and learned about the flaws with the paradigm that the earth is billions of years old and that things lived millions of years old, and that there was evidence that the earth was young, thousands of years old, the 6,000 number was what I learned. And so for 20 years, that was what I was believing, right? Sometimes I would hear that some people say it's 7,000 to 8,000 years old, but I didn't really know why. Like, I didn't know where that number came from, because it seemed like with this chronology that Ussher laid out, it seemed to pretty strongly point to about 6,000 years. Even though when you stack up those dates, there could be a little bit of error in there, but I didn't know, how are they coming up with over 1,000 years discrepancy? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So to start with, we're going to talk about the Masoretic Text. This is what our Old Testaments, our English Bibles, were translated from. These are Hebrew texts as they existed when English Bibles started to be translated. Soon after the destruction of the temple in AD 70, you had all these different sects of Judaism, like the Sadducees and the Essenes, the Zealots, and those all sort of faded away, except for the sect of the Pharisees, and the other sect that remained were the Christians, what we would call today Messianic Jews, but Jews who were believers in Christ. That was, in the beginning, especially, just regarded as a sect of Judaism. And so the Essenes are the ones that we have the Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered. Those were stored away by the Essenes. And the Zealots were the ones that were big on wanting to overthrow Rome. Yeah, Robbie?
The Dead Sea Scrolls, were they the Masoretic Text?
No, no.
Septuagint?
So they were discovered fairly recently, but when the Bible was being translated into English, there weren't any Dead Sea Scrolls to refer to because they hadn't been discovered. They were still hidden and unknown. So the Masoretes, which means masters of tradition, were rabbinic scribes. So the Pharisees later became known as rabbinic Jews. So that was basically, if you think about the New Testament and who the Pharisees were, mostly they were in conflict with Jesus, right? With some exceptions. The Pharisees, effectively, they were like the last sect of non-Christian Jews that were remaining in the generations that followed the destruction of the temple. And so they kind of had a monopoly on the Hebrew texts, right? And so their scribes, called the Masoretes, or the masters of tradition, developed what we call the Masoretic Text in the 7th to 9th century. They might have started a little sooner than that, but these things, it's hard to put a date on it because they were a process. It took a long time. But they were kind of standardizing the Hebrew texts and adding vowel markers so that you could more clearly understand how to pronounce the Hebrew words that didn't have vowels. And that became the standard, really the only Hebrew version of the Old Testament. And then this was prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which was in 1946. This was the only extant Hebrew language Old Testament text that we had. And the oldest ones that we have, like the manuscripts that have survived, the oldest ones are from about the 11th century. So they're not 2,000 years old. They're closer to 1,000 years old. In the 1500s, when they're starting to do English translations, this was the Hebrew text that was available. Nearly, I say nearly, I could have almost put just all translations in English, use the Masoretic text as the basis for the Old Testament. Now, there's some exceptions to that, like especially maybe some Catholic Bibles and things like that. But like if you're talking about the King James Bible, the American Standard, the New American Standard, the English Standard, all the familiar translations, every single one of them has as the source for the Old Testament the Masoretic text. That's what they use because the thought is if you're translating, sometimes you hear ignorant skeptics will say, well, the Bible's been translated so many times, it's a translation of a translation of a translation. And that's not true at all. It's translated once, multiple times, but each time it's translated in English or whatever, it's translated from the original language, which for the Old Testament was Hebrew. And so there was a thought that, and it makes sense, certainly, if you're talking about you're translating into English, that you would want to go right to the source and use Hebrew for the Old Testament, even though there were Greek and Latin and other languages.
Isn't the King James a translation of Latin from the Latin?
No, technically it's a revision of the Bishop's Bible, which came before it in 1602. But ultimately, the primary text source for the Old Testament would have been these Masoretic texts.
Yeah, it was Jerome, when he translated the Vulgate, he went and talked to the Masoretes.
Yeah, so even the Vulgate had a preference for the Masoretic texts, which well, that would have been before this, though, right? Because if the Masoretic texts were...
Well, it's not the
but the Hebrew.
He went and talked to the Masoretes. What, what's your opinion of Isaiah? Oh, well, blah, blah, blah.
But you can see where, like, if you're translating in English and you have the language that it was written in, or at least, something close to that, or a translation, you might think it would be better to go right to the original language. Now, there's some places where some deference is given to what was in the Greek as far as interpretation, because you still have an ancient interpretation from Hebrew scholars from our perspective over 2,000 years ago. What did they think that the Hebrew text meant?
Amen.
So that is useful, right? But as far as like you're gonna start with a page of one language and translate into English, they would start with the Hebrew Masoretic Text by default, right? Even if in certain areas they would refer to other work, other translations before them. Then we have the Septuagint. The Septuagint is a translation of Jewish texts, which included, but is not limited to, the Holy Scriptures into Greek. So this was the first translation. I should say, if you really get into the details of this, we tend to call any ancient Greek translation the Septuagint, but that, if you want to get really picky, that's not really what it is, because you could have, it depends on how broad you're kind of using that term. But in general, we use translations of the Hebrew into Greek from the 2nd and 3rd centuries BC are usually referred to as the Septuagint. It was sort of began around 280 BC. The Torah was finished about 250 BC, and then other things got translated too. So if you have a very strict definition, it's only that Torah translation that's technically the Septuagint, but you'll commonly see Isaiah or whatever. If you're referring to the Greek text, it'll identify it as a Septuagint. If it's over 2,000 years old and it's in Greek and it's the Old Testament, people will refer to it as a Septuagint. But you could get, some
So you're
ultra,
saying that ultimately, if you're really technical, it's only in the first 5 books.
right. But that really doesn't matter. Like you'll see everywhere, if there's a reference to an ancient Greek text, it'll say LXX, which means Septuagint. The Septuagint was commissioned by Alexandria to be preserved in the library, which has since been destroyed by fire.
Did you say Alexander?
Ptolemy made it in memoriam of Alexander.
Yeah, named after Alexander the Great.
Yeah.
It was translated by 70 Hebrew scholars, or maybe 72. There's sort of a legend that there were 6 from each tribe, but that's probably not true, because by then, even I think did people know which of the 12 tribes they were from at that point in history?
They knew, but that would be really difficult.
But that's where the name Septuagint comes from. It comes from the Latin word for 70.
They were far more concerned that these men knew the Old Testament.
Yeah. But it became commonly known as the Septuagint, or the translation of the 70. And that's often abbreviated with the Roman numerals LXX. So if you ever see some reference in something you're reading, LXX, that's shorthand for Septuagint. And I didn't mention that Masoretic Text, sometimes you'll see that abbreviated as MT, like capital M, capital T. When these are kind of being talked about together or compared or something, you'll see those two abbreviations a lot. The Septuagint was in wide use in the 1st century and is often quoted by New Testament authors. Sometimes when you see a text being quoted in the New Testament and you compare it in your own Bible, you go and look up that verse in the Old Testament and it'll appear a little bit differently. And you might think, why is that? Well, the New Testament's written in Greek, the Old Testament's written in Hebrew. So on the one hand, the New Testament effectively is a translation of a translation, because it translated from the Greek, which was translated from the Hebrew into English, whereas the Old Testament's translated directly from the Hebrew. And so that'll get some differences, but some differences are beyond just word choice, but maybe it's a little bit looser than that even. And that's the reason, is because these New Testament quotes are actually quoting from the Septuagint, sometimes verbatim.
Did Jesus always quote from the Septuagint?
No. And even that, like when we talk about did Jesus quote, it's hard to say for sure. When we see a quote from Jesus, like even in the different Gospels, you have quotes from Jesus that use different words in one compared to the other, right? They're all somewhat paraphrases, because you're going off people's memories. And so really it's a question of the New Testament authors. What are they kind of using as their reference point when they're quoting scripture? It's difficult to say in some cases if the speaker was speaking, quoting from the Septuagint, or if the author is referencing the Septuagint when they're writing it down. We don't really have a great way of determining that. But one way or the other, though, you can have people today who are real sticklers about what translation you use. Yet in the Bible, you see in the first century, there didn't seem to be that level of hang up as far as it's got to be this specific, pure, perfect version, because we see the Septuagint, which is not a perfect translation. I don't think anyone really claims that it's inerrant in its.
People claim all the time, though, that King James is
Right,
perfect.
right. So if the King James is absolutely perfect with its word choice, in every case, anytime that you deviate in English from what the King James has in English, that's a change for the worse. You have people who effectively idolize the King James Bible. Now, I'm not saying the King James isn't a great translation, but we shouldn't put it on this unrealistic pedestal. You have two questions. Were the text that it was translated from perfect? And then is every single case the words that they chose perfect? The translators didn't make those sorts of claims. They said that they were making a good translation better, but they didn't make a claim of perfection in their work. They were just doing their best. So you have a certain sort of sect of people who put a much greater claim on the King James Bible than the people who created the Bible to begin with. Like I mentioned before, they weren't starting from scratch. They started with copies of the 1602 Bishop's Bible and made margin notes and crossed things out. And sometimes they would change something and then change it again, And then there's been multiple editions of the King James Bible that has corrections and things too. So it's not like in 1611 they were totally done. There's been, printing errors and things that get corrected and minor revisions to it also. As I said before, too, the Greek translation from over 2,000 years ago provide valuable insights of how Jews interpreted their own scripture back then. So if someone says today, one example, oh, that word, born of a virgin, that doesn't actually say virgin. That just says young woman. Well, in Greek, which had been translated a couple centuries before Jesus was born, they translated it with a word that pretty much just means virgin. So Hebrews from over 200 years before Jesus was born regarded that as being talking about a virgin. So that's the sort of thing, like if you get someone who says, well, that can't mean that, we have sort of a second opinion of people over 2,000 years ago. What did they think it meant? So that provides some evidence about the messianic prophecies that those existed before Jesus was born. Sometimes you'll come across people when you talk about prophecies fulfilled, they'll claim that that was written into the text after the fact. Well, here we have, not only do we have evidence that the Hebrew texts existed, but because we know historically they were already translated into another language and they were all over the world, you couldn't change the text. Like imagine today if you tried to change the Bible, right? How are you going to do that? Because there's Bibles all over the place. You might change your own version of the Bible, like the Watchtower Society, says in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was a God. But you can't get all of the other Bibles to agree with that. So that becomes an outlier, right? Same thing with this. All these prophecies are preserved and translated and distributed all over the place. And so there would be no way you could add prophecies into the Old Testament and have them in the majority of these texts. Okay, so there's one place that we're going to look at where the Masoretic Text and the Septuagint are quite different. And this is in the genealogies that are in Genesis chapter 5 and 11. This is where you get the time periods between generations from Adam down to Abraham or so. So in Genesis 5, you have Adam to Noah, and then in Genesis 11, you have Noah to Abraham. And if you look at any English Bible, pretty much, you're going to see numbers that match what's in the left side of the page. And just as an example, it will say that Adam was 130 years old when he begat Seth. But in the Septuagint, it says that he was 230 years old. There's 100 years difference between them. And then if you look at the years that he lived after Seth was born, in the English Bibles translated from the Masoretic Text, it says that he went on to live another 800 years, whereas in the Septuagint, it says he went on to live another 700 years. And so the extra 100 years in the beginning age is deducted from the remaining years. And so when you get to and he lived a total of 930 years, you get to the same answer. So the numbers are different, but the end result is the same as far as how long he lived. And you have that happen in each of those lines that I have highlighted there. It ends up being 12 times altogether. And then there's one where the difference is only 50 years. So this looks like not a scribal error where, this was something that someone accidentally did. This looks very deliberate, right? Because the math is working out in Genesis 5. Now, the format isn't the same in Genesis 11, where they give the remaining years, but they don't give the total age. So if you figure out the total age, those will be different, but it's not in the text. So they didn't bother to change the remaining years. But somewhere along the line here, somebody made a change. And so the question is, which one more closely represents what Moses originally wrote, right? Was it the longer dates or the shorter dates? So if the Masoretic Text has what was originally there, then somehow the Septuagint has 100 years added to all these generations, except for we see Nahor, which is only 50 years. Or the other alternative is that 2,000 years ago, when the Septuagint was being translated, that it was accurately being translated with what the Hebrew said at that time, and that somewhere since then, the Hebrew text had the dates reduced, right? So which of those is the case? That's kind of what we're looking into now. Now, Nahor having a difference of only 50 years, I think is an important clue, because if this is a deliberate change, and it seems to be, why wouldn't this be 100 years also? So if it's the Septuagint that's being, for some reason, having 100 years added, you could take 29, which is, the true number, and add 100 to it and get 129, right? But if 79 is the true number, you can't subtract 100 from 79, right? So you subtract 50 instead. And the way these are, you see how these are kind of clustered, like around Noah, you don't have any changes, and around Abraham, you don't have changes, because the generations that are changed are the ones that can be changed without kind of messing up the narrative, because the story focuses on Adam, and then you have a genealogy, and then it focuses on Noah and his sons and things. And then you have a genealogy, and then it focuses on Abraham. And so when you're dealing with Abraham's father, you see his hasn't been changed, because if you change that, it would kind of mess up the narrative of the story. Yeah. So the generations that differ are carefully selected where they could be changed without impacting the rest of the narrative, which is another clue that these were deliberate changes, regardless of the motivation. But yeah, I think that Nahor, differing by only 50 years, leans toward the Septuagint being more representative of the real numbers, because otherwise you would think that would say 129 instead of 79, right? There's a reason why you would only subtract 50, but there's no reason why you wouldn't add 100. Okay, so if you compare these lifespans, we see that before the flood, which is the section on the left, the blue shaded is post-flood. In either case, you have sort of a decay of lifespans, of longevity among people that happens after the flood. So it looks like something happened with the catastrophic flood that resulted in generations living shorter and shorter periods of time. Whereas before the flood, it seemed like people were living in excess of 900 years. You can see that line's pretty flat. That short one there, Enoch, he was taken up, so he's a special case. But most of these guys were living to be 900 plus years. And then you see kind of like a exponential decay after that. And if you look at the first century historian Josephus, who wrote Antiquities of the Jews, and he wrote in Greek, but he claims, we'll see a quote on the next slide, that he was referencing Hebrew scriptures. And his genealogy, his timeline, because he wrote sort of like a retelling of the biblical account, and the numbers that he used were consistent with the Septuagint chronology, where like Seth was born 230 years, not 130 years. And so that's another witness, right? We have 2,000 years ago, somebody writing, saying he's using Hebrew text, yet having numbers that are consistent with what was in the Septuagint. evidence that back then the Hebrew matched the Septuagint. It wasn't that it was changed in the process. And we also see more evidence, in addition to his claim that he was using Hebrew texts, is in the way he spelled the names. On the right there, we have the English names, then as they appear in Greek letters in the Septuagint, and then the way he spells them on the far right. And you can see there's differences. When you're translating from one language to another and using different alphabets, there's judgment calls that you have to make. That's why you could have in English Judas or Judah, the same Hebrew name, but do you spell the at the end with an H or an S, right? And so this is the same sort of thing in Greek. You have evidence here that Josephus was working independently of the Septuagint translators and that he was transliterating these Hebrew names into Greek on his own and not just copying what was in the Septuagint, because he was working from Hebrew texts. So all the evidence, in addition to his claim, are that he was in fact using Hebrew texts from his day. And yet they match what's in the Septuagint, not what's in our Hebrew text today, the Masoretic text. And also just to note, you see there's one column on the yellow portion missing. That's Canaan, son of Arphaxad. Now, there was another Canaan there that was the fourth from Adam there. And that name does appear in Luke 3:36. It's not in our Masoretic-based Genesis 11. That name isn't there. And so this is sort of a little bit of a separate issue. The question is, did some early scribe accidentally write Canaan's name twice because it appeared earlier? And then, did some of that go back into the Greek text to try to reconcile it, or it was in the Greek text and that's why it's in Luke? That's sort of a separate issue that, that one could be one way or the other, independent of these differences that are 100 years and then 50 years, that those are very deliberate. So, but it's just interesting to note that in our copies of Luke, in our own Bibles, Canaan, son of Arphaxad, appears in Luke, but doesn't appear in our Genesis 11. So here's a quote from Josephus in the preface of Antiquities of the Jews. He says, "Now I have undertaken the present work, as thinking it will appear to all the Greeks worthy of their study, for it will contain all of our antiquities and the constitution of our government as interpreted out of Hebrew scriptures." So he's saying he's using Hebrew scriptures, not a Greek translation. So if you take those lifespans and you map them out on a timeline, they end up looking quite a bit different, especially after the flood. You can see the Masoretic text, because of those 100 years, everything's kind of squished together compared to the Septuagint. And as a result, as those lifespans are decaying exponentially after the flood, without the extra 100 years between generations, you have a lot of generations where the younger generations are being outlived by older generations, and everyone's kind of living at once here. Whereas in the Septuagint, you have more of kind of a natural decay where lifespans are getting shorter, but you still see, in general, sons outliving their fathers and grandfathers. Now, in Genesis 25:8, Abraham, at his death, is described as living to be a good old age, an old man, and full of years. Sounds like he's an old guy, right? Yet, according to our English Bibles, based on the Masoretic text, he is outlived by his great, 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 great grandfather, Eber, by 4 years. So today, if you die and your grandfather is still alive, people aren't talking about, well, you lived a full life, you lived to be an old man, right? You would have to be like 30 or something to have your grandfather still alive and he's 90. You wouldn't describe someone as being an old man. But if the Septuagint timeline is correct, then these people have been dead for centuries. He would be old by the standards of that day, because generations are getting shorter, and he lived to be very old by our standards. He was 175, but there weren't people who were 600 still alive in his day. That was centuries ago that people were living that long. And so relative to his peers, he was an old man. And so that's another piece of evidence that, I mean, if the Bible describes him as being an old man, that it's more consistent with the Septuagint timeline than the Masoretic timeline, our English chronology. Okay. This is where you get a big problem with trying to reconcile the 6,000 year timeline with other history or extra biblical history. At the bottom here, we've got the Masoretic timeline that is popularized by Ussher from the 17th century. And that places the flood at 2349 BC, creation at 4004 BC. Now, a big problem is that Egyptology, chronologies of Egyptian history, place the building of the Great Pyramid at about 2500 BC, give or take a little bit, and the Sphinx just a little bit before that, maybe 2600 BC. So that would put those structures at a date that comes before the Great Flood. And they sure don't look like they've been flooded, right? If they were flooded, you would expect there'd be all kinds of sediment over them. If they were even still intact at all, they would be likely just be wiped out. But the fact that they're there and that, there's Egyptian chronologies and things that place that around 2500 BC, that's a big problem if you think that the flood happened after that. And so, maybe a young earth creationist will try to argue that the Egyptian chronology is wrong, and they'll try to place the building of those structures centuries later. But that doesn't really work out very well because the Egyptians are mentioned in the Bible quite a bit, and there's interaction between Hebrew history and Egyptian history, and there's really not a good way to reconcile that with a flood that happened in the 2350 range BC. But if you look at the Septuagint's version, now the flood comes hundreds of years before the building of the pyramid and the Sphinx. And so this is actually great news as a young earth creationist, is that this something that might get brought up as a problem, and it really is a problem, is reconciled. So if the numbers that are in our Bible are actually in error, but we can see what the real numbers are, now the flood gets pushed back several centuries. And now there's centuries between the flood where the nation of Egypt can develop and then build these structures. And now the date of creation would be pushed back. I have that as an estimate there, 5500 BC roughly. That's not an exact date, but we can't really get real exact with these dates too because of the way they stack up. I think even putting 2349, like if you're doing a chronology, sometimes you have to kind of pick an answer, but it could be 5400 years, it could be 5500 years BC, something like that, but it's in that range. And so that's where now you hear the date of creation when people say 7,000 to 8,000 years. Now you know why that is, right? So in the last couple of years since I've learned about this, I've gotten in the habit of no longer referring to 6,000 years, but saying 7,000 or 7,000 to 8,000 or 7,500 years as the age of the earth. What got my attention with this is a video to give you some background on this. If you're at all interested in the flood and creation and understanding, why the world looks the way it is, this series by Bryan Bryan with a Y, goes through material that's in a book by Dr. Walt Brown called In the Beginning, and it's the best creation flood model around. It's called the Hydroplane Theory, and it basically lays out that the flood waters came from under the crust, the fountains of the deep burst forth, and the continents slid into their current positions following the flood, riding on this water. And that's how we get the mountains and a lot of the geological features and stuff. It's a really great series. We can't get into all that because it would take us a month to get through it. But one of the things that it talks about is, in addition to like what we talked about with the days becoming a little bit shorter, why is the moon more marked up on the side that faces us versus the other side? Because the stuff that hit the moon came from the Earth during the flood. And the debris from the Earth also formed comets and asteroids and things like that. And so that's the background. He's going to talk about using comets based on the assumption that comets had their origin with the fountains of the deep bursting forth to try to figure out when the flood happened.
Sometimes people ask, if comets are really from Earth, couldn't you just calculate orbits of all the comets backward from today and then see them all converge near the Earth at the same time of the flood? Unfortunately, comet orbits are changed to varying degrees when they pass near a planet. The closer the pass and the more massive the planet, the greater the change. If a comet, 1, seldom comes near a planet because its orbit takes it far from the planets most of the time, and 2, has been observed many times in the past 2,000 years, so its orbital path is reasonably well known, and 3, powerful computer programs have projected it and all the planets back 4,000 to 6,000 years ago to try to calculate how these inevitable perturbations have altered the orbits, then we should find these comets near the Earth at about the same time the flood began. So in spite of these challenges, however, 2 comets best fit these requirements, Comet Swift-Tuttle and the most well-known comet, Halley's Comet.
Perihelion for these 2 comets is very close to Earth's orbit. However, as you can see, rarely will they both be close to the Earth at the same time. Using the many historical observations of these 2 comets does allow us to analyze statistically when each would have been near Earth at perihelion, by projecting their periods back in time. The statistical approach of analysis also allows us to keep track of the total error in our conclusions. So does this method result in showing these 2 comets and Earth, all 3 bodies, once occupied the same relatively tiny volume of space? If so, is that just a coincidence? This graph plots the closeness in days that the 2 comets would pass perihelion near Earth's orbit as the analysis marches their earliest orbital periods back in time. So for example, 4,200 years ago, Halley's Comet and Swift-Tuttle's perihelion times were roughly 22,360 days, or about 61 years apart. 4,400 years ago, their perihelion separation was much closer, roughly 949 days, or about only 2.6 years apart. So as you can see in the zoomed-in area of the slide, from the time one comet passed perihelion, it was 2.6 years until the other comet passed its perihelion. This is closer than 61 years, but when we consider we are looking for an event that occurred within a few weeks or at most months, 2.6 years is actually a very loose clustering, with one of the comets being well outside Jupiter's orbit. Interestingly, continuing to go back in time, these 2 comets do not cluster significantly close to Earth at all. That is until you go back to around 5,300 years ago, or 3290 BC. Amazingly, the analysis, using the comet's earliest known periods based on the earliest observation, shows that inside of the year 3290 BC, both of these very clock-like comets passed perihelion near Earth within just 35 days of each other. At our current timescale of 2 seconds a year, it is hard to see and appreciate how close these 3 bodies were to each other in such a short period of time. To see this more clearly, we'll slow the animation so a year equals 24 seconds. Now at this much slower pace, we can see Comet Swift-Tuttle enter near Earth's orbit and pass its perihelion. Then within only 35 days, Halley's Comet passes perihelion. Of course, each comet's period would have changed slightly with each orbit due to gravitational perturbations from other large orbiting bodies like planets, just as is observed today, so there is some uncertainty as to the actual time that this occurred. However, the odds of a comet receiving a boost from another object are the same as the odds of the comet feeling a drag, so the error distribution is expected to be a normal bell-shaped curve. Again, the historical record of these comets passing by Earth gives a suitable sample of data that reveals how each comet's period changes over time, and this can be used to show the expected error in the 3290 BC mean date. Statistical analysis of these 2 comets results in a 1 sigma standard deviation of plus or minus 100 years from the mean date. As you can see, no matter where Earth was in its orbital path, this is still a fantastically close clustering of these 3 bodies in 3290 BC. But is this statistically significant? Or just a random but very common occurrence? In other words, how often does a deep spike in the data similar to this 35-day clustering occur? Well, statistically it turns out that if the orbits were just random, then we'd have to search forward or backward in time an average of 333,000 years in order to find a clustering event that was at least as close as the 35-day event that occurred 5,300 years ago. If this data were printed on 8x11 copy paper and you printed out 2,000 years of data on each page, you would have to print out 176 pages of data before you found another spike in the data that was as deep. Or another way to visualize the rareness of this event
would be to watch the opening slide of this section that was running at a rate of 4 years per second. We would have to watch the animation at this speed an average of just over 23 straight hours to see the tight clustering occur again. So a very unusual and rare event indeed. Statistically, it is unlikely that this is simply a coincidence. Considering all we've just covered and running the clustering event forward in time roughly 5,300 years ago, we see that the more likely scenario is that during the first weeks or months of the flood, clusters of material that eventually formed into these two comets, and all other comets for that matter, were launched during separate powerful pulse events from the fluttering crust of the Earth. Follow this link for more information on this statistical analysis methodology and how the Greek Septuagint translation of the Old Testament genealogies comes surprisingly close to matching the time of Noah and the flood to this astronomical data.
That's it. So you can see now when they come back, they sort of go around the sun, but the proposal is that they would have initially been launched from the Earth, but because the sun is so much larger than the Earth on its return trip, it's the sun that kind of dominates its orbital path. I think that was pretty clear from the animation there at the end. But the comets are another witness that the Septuagint timeline is the true timeline.
Yeah.
That Usher's timeline that we see out in the hallway and stuff, and it's in our Bibles, unfortunately are in error. The Earth is actually in the 7,000 to 8,000 years old range, and that understanding that clears up that conflict between the biblical timeline and the Egyptian chronologies. Those don't have to be in conflict. They aren't in conflict. It's just that unfortunately we have the wrong numbers in our Bibles.